Newt Gingrich went to Congress as a backbencher from Georgia. He and Jimmy Carter went to Washington. Newt Gingrich came up with a contract for America, and it changed the country. It changed Congress. He got welfare reform, they balanced the budget, they did things that they hadn't done in years and years, and he certainly made his mark. Since then, I don't think there's anybody who is more articulate and insightful in his commentary on what's going on in Washington. He has a podium of policy and politics that I think is second to none. And we're delighted to have him tonight. He is joined by another prominent author. Newt has had 14 bestsellers. He's been here for every one of them. And before the East Room, he spoke frequently from this stage as speaker and as author for all of his books. So we're always pleased when he comes back. And with Calissa, who now is in her 5th Ellis the Elephant book, and this one is Christmas in America. They have so much going on all the time. Even today, they did press interviews, they did the Lincoln Club, they were at the Reagan Library last night. Now, they got a great reception at the Lincoln Club and at the Reagan Library. I want to outdo it. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the former Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, accompanied by Calista Gingrich.
Well, let me first of all thank all of you for being here tonight. Calista and I are delighted to be here. I've done this so long and have had Sandy introduce me so often that I kind of feel like he must have been earning his Eagle Scout badge when I first came here, but he does an amazing job. He personifies what developed the library. And I just think it's remarkable, and I wish every American could visit this library and learn a great deal about our country's history. So Calista and I are always glad to have a chance to come back here. We actually have 3 projects underway. This is volume 5 in Ellis the Elephant, because we concluded that we might or might not be able to reform the schools, but we could reach young people directly. And so by developing Ellis the Elephant as a character and by teaching American history with really books that are very pretty and that rhyme, we feel that we're actually reaching young people with the essence of American history even before they get to school. And so that for us has been a great joy to watch. And I can tell you when you read the Ellis the Elephant series, between finding the facts that are appropriate for 4 to 8-year-olds, finding the words that explain the facts that are appropriate to 4 to 8-year-olds, and then getting them to rhyme. Every fold-out, every 2 pages of her book is the equivalent of a chapter of mine in terms of the time and the care, and so it's a wonderful thing. And Christmas in America is a great book, and it's a remarkable tradition that goes all the way back to the Jamestown settlers before they even got here, celebrating Christmas in 1606 on the ship on the way here. So it's a lot of fun, and she has a lot of unique facts that she has dug up. I learned a great deal by following her research trail. When we were launching an earlier Ellis the Elephant book, Fox and Friends had Calista on, and in order to set up the conversation about American history, they sent somebody out in the field to interview people about American. So that didn't quite work. About American history. And when they got to one young lady and they said, "Who was George Washington?" And she looked puzzled for a minute, and she said, well, I think he was the president. Didn't he come right after Lincoln? That set us on the second project, which is we're currently working on a film on why George Washington matters, called The First American. And we're in the middle of shooting for that film, which is a very exciting adventure. And the more you study Washington, the more you learn about Washington, the more you realize why he truly was the father of the country and why every young American should learn about him. So we have a dual project of creating a film and then using social media to reach people under 30 directly without having to worry about going through the schools or going through all the various liberals who try not to teach American history. We just want to reach kids in a way that they like it and they enjoy it. So that's a big project for us. The third project is the book that we just released that I wrote called Duplicity. Now I know, watching Washington from California, that the idea of duplicity having anything to do with Washington probably strikes you as strange. But I can tell you, when we first started writing this book in June of 2013, we had no idea that it would be published the same month as Secretary Clinton testifying in front of the Benghazi Committee. So it's really kind of a weird moment. I was very interested in writing Duplicity to drive three messages, but to do it in a way that was fun and dynamic and exciting, because you can reach a much bigger audience if you entertain and not just educate. And so the first message was that terrorism is a worldwide problem, that it's closer to epidemiology and dealing with viral diseases than it is to traditional nation-state problems. So when somebody says to you, they're involved in counterterrorism and their focus is ISIS, you know immediately they don't understand the problem. Because the problem isn't ISIS. ISIS is a tiny subset of a worldwide problem. I think the latest count I saw is there may be 126 different organizations engaged in terrorism. And of course they change names and they routinely evolve. And so I think it's very important to understand how widespread it is, and that it's here in the United States as well as overseas, and that it's transmitted in part by the internet. So we have a Somali American who's a patriot in Minneapolis who is running for Congress, while his brother, who has gone the other way, is the #2 leader of al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization in Somalia. Now imagine the family tension between the guy who wants to be a congressman to defeat terrorism and the guy who wants to be a terrorist to defeat the United States. This is a family civil war. Then we have a president who decides to be clever. And the second message of Duplicity is that when politicians make national security decisions for political reasons, they run very big risks. Because unlike domestic politics, you can do lots of things in domestic politics, and it may work, it may not work, but it doesn't have the life and death consequences that national security can have. And so we have a president who makes a series of decisions about trying to do something in Somalia for re-election purposes, and it blows up and it doesn't work. And it's just a reminder that we ought to approach national security by putting the safety of Americans first, not by putting the poll numbers of politicians first. And the third message we really work at is that when politicians make major mistakes close to elections, they lie. And so the president, having made a major mistake, decides to lie. When the president lies, the CIA, to protect the president, decides to lie. So the CIA in Duplicity is now telling Congress things that aren't true, which is against the law. And so you get into the kind of muddle that you might be watching tomorrow on television. I hope people will find that the way we wrote it, given my background and the number of different rooms I've been in, that this helps them better understand the complexity, the dynamics, the way the bureaucracies operate and the way personalities operate, and how really challenging the next 10 or 20 years are going to be. So that's why we're here. We're looking forward to signing books later on, and well, we'd look forward to working with you on a whole variety of things. I always come here and feel like I'm back home with folks who deeply share our values and our concern for the survival of freedom. Now, let me talk for a couple minutes. We'll presently get to questions, and you can ask what you want to, but I thought I could hardly come here and not talk about the House and the speakership and the presidential campaign. And I think they're actually mixed together. You know, when Eric Cantor, who was the majority leader, lost his seat in a Republican primary to a candidate who only spent about 1/15 of the amount of money that Cantor had, that was an early warning signal that something was going wrong. And all of us sort of thought that it was about Cantor and the way he went back home and the mistakes he made. When Boehner then had to resign, so now you have the majority leader loses in the primary, and now you have the speaker stepping down. And then Kevin McCarthy, who I regard as one of the great rising stars of the party, and somebody who I strongly believe has a great future, found that he just literally couldn't get to 218 votes. So now you have the new majority leader, the speaker, and the old majority leader. And at that point it hit me that this is not a personality problem. This is a systems problem. That what's going wrong is profound and different than we're used to dealing with. And as I backed out, look and see, I have a little bit of water here. As I backed out and I began thinking about this from a whole new standpoint, that it wasn't that Boehner was doing the old things wrong. It was that Boehner was doing the old things that used to work in a world where they don't work anymore. And John, by the way, was remarkably successful. He grew the Republican majority in the House to the largest number since 1928. So there are 247 House Republicans. Now, the downside of that is there are 247 House Republicans. So you've got to, you know, when there are 12 of you, you can have meetings pretty easily. When there are 247, you've really got to think a lot about communications and organization and management, because there's so many different people and they form different factions. And that's part of what's been going on. And so I began looking at what were the big arguments. And two things hit me. One, which Senator Mike Lee did a brilliant article, I recommend to all of you, in the Federalist last week, in which he argued that in the age of Uber and Apple and Amazon and ATMs, you need to rethink the entire structure of the Congress because it's too centralized, it's too territorial, it's too secretive, and you really need to create an open space where people can be innovative and have ideas, and you can have a dramatically more inventive and more open kind of system. It's a really terrific article. And I think he's basically right. But there's a second part. This country is now dividing in a way that's very profound. If you are a liberal Democrat, you are essentially relatively satisfied. You're getting bigger government, you're getting left-wing social policies, you're getting weakness in foreign policy, you have your president in the White House, and you broadly share his values and his views. And so if you look at it at approval, disapproval, liberal Democrats are sort of relatively content right now. Independents and Republicans are in a rage. So you're seeing this widening between the two sides. Gallup has done a couple of things. I do some work with Gallup, and they've done a couple of things that are fascinating. Brazil has a huge scandal involving the national oil company run by the government. There's an estimate that the national oil company may have paid $40 billion in bribes. Not million, billion. In Brazil, in the middle of the scandal, in the Gallup World Poll, 74% of Brazilians said that there is widespread corruption in government. Now, at $40 billion in bribes, that's a reasonable response. Here's what's amazing. The number for the United States is 75%. More Americans believe there's widespread corruption in the United States government than Brazilians believe there's widespread corruption in the Brazilian government. Now, that's a level of alienation that's really amazing. And to show you how big this is, the Washington Post, let me repeat, the Washington Post today had an article that said, the scariest thing on Halloween will not be the costumes, it will be the federal government. And they go through polling data on how much people are now afraid of the government and how much they think that the bureaucrats are out of control, that they are threatening our very liberties, that you cannot trust the politicians. And when you realize that 4 out of the 5 wealthiest counties in the United States are in the Washington metropolitan area, what you have is an imperial government draining the rest of the country in order to prop itself up. Now what that's led to is, and this is not true on the left, and the left, remember, includes most of the news media. So the left over here is going, why are these people screaming? Why are they irrational? Why are they saying, and you'll hear this when you hear about the Freedom Caucus. They use really harsh language. These guys must be nuts. No, they're really angry. Well, what are they really angry about? They're really angry about facts. You have a Veterans Administration which is an absolute total scandal in which nothing has been fixed. And you just had a senator get up yesterday and block a bill that is the Veterans Administration Accountability Act. So in Los Angeles, for example, you had 3,000 veterans' requests for appointments deleted from the computer so they could report that the lines were shorter. Now that's a criminal behavior that risked the lives of those veterans. Nobody went to jail and nobody got fired. And so on the right and in the center, you have people who are just totally fed up. Now what does that lead to? Well, all of you know, because you've been watching TV. It leads to the Donald. You know, and the Donald comes along. There's a great study that just came out. I don't know how many of you have seen this. But there's a technique, I don't know what it is, but there's this technique where you can measure the reading level of a speech. And what level do people give speeches at? Most politicians give speeches at 7th or 8th grade levels. Trump's is 4th grade. This is going to be a great country again because it's going to be great and the changes are going to be huge and you are going to love them. Well, what part of that do you want to oppose? You know, we actually have a lot of respect for Trump. We belong to Trump National and we've known him for a good while. And and this is again one of those Washington things. People say, well, he hasn't had any experience. Well, his first Time magazine cover was 1989. He has created and run an empire that includes lots and lots of golf courses worldwide, lots and lots of hotels, a number of casinos. He has a tie brand that at one time was the best-selling tie in the United States. He had a top 10 NBC TV show called The Apprentice. He runs the Miss Universe contest, but he really doesn't do much. And you look at these people and you say, let me get this straight. You think going to PAC events to raise money qualifies you better than running a multi-thousand nationwide and worldwide company? And you go, well, of course. I mean, what issues has he dealt with? Well, first of all, he's dealt with city government. He's dealt with state government. He's dealt with the federal government. But he's been on the other side. Now, do we think that it makes him better prepared to have been ripped off by bureaucrats or less prepared? And so you go through all this stuff, and I'm not advocating Trump, I'm just trying to describe, because let me tell you, I think this is all unexplainable. I mean, if you had said to me in January, I'd be coming out to the Nixon Library to explain to you that Donald Trump was number 1 and that Ben Carson was number 2, and between them they have 48% of the vote, I would have said, sure. I mean, that's not explainable. And here's part of why it's not explainable. I can, if it was only Trump, first of all, if it was only Trump, I could say to you it might be a bubble and it may well go away. The challenge for regular, normal candidates is if Trump starts to collapse, his votes go to Carson. They don't go to normal people. You know, so all of these normal politicians who are standing out here with their consultants and their pollsters and their advertising agency, and they're ready to go. The problem is where they're going doesn't work. And so think about this concept of experience. You know, Ben Carson, who I think is a more complicated person and a harder person to explain than Trump. I mean, Trump is the natural product of the Kardashian era. You know, you sit at home, you tweet, everybody reads your tweet, the newspapers start to beat you up, so you do a new tweet and say to them, why don't they look at the new tweet? It's not the old tweet. I don't know why you're paying attention to that anymore, and by the way, I'll tweet again if that'll help you get off that last topic. And by that point, people have forgotten whatever the first tweet was. No, I get that. Calista said, turned to me one day and she said, this is a reality show candidate. He's just living out The Apprentice for president. And there's a lot to that. I mean, he's got it down pat. So that's Trump. Carson, I mean, you get this bombastic, loud guy over here, right? And then you have Carson, who is so quiet, if you didn't know he was on the stage, you'd wonder what he was doing. And Carson's entire technique is to be quiet. So he says the boldest, most radical things so quietly that it takes the news media 3 days to figure out what he said. And then, of course, the news media wants to fight with him. Now, because they think that this guy is shallow and doesn't know very much and so forth. Now, first of all, and this is very heretical for me to say, and when it gets back to Washington, I'll be in deep trouble. It is harder to become a world-class neurosurgeon than it is to become a U.S. Senator. It takes more brain power, and you do more real things. Now, I know this is, in Washington, seen as, you know, I'm selling out. But think about it. This is a guy who, by the time he was 33, was so good that he became the youngest department head in the history of Johns Hopkins, at 33. Now, how good do you think he is at managing people if he has that job at 33? And he grew the department. He created and grew the entire department. This is, they say, well, what would he be like under stress? You know, I mean, this is a guy who became famous separating conjoined Siamese twins in what is a really very tricky operation, because you have to worry about both of their blood pressures and both of their respiration, and you can't do something for this one that will kill this one, so it's a really complicated formula. It took 20 hours with a 70-person operating team. Now, when you talk about stress, imagine it's hour 19. Probably at least as difficult as negotiating with the Congress. But see, in Washington, neither of these two guys count because none of their experience is in the things that Washington validates. It's sort of like we give away language teacher certificates to people who can't speak the language, but they can teach it because they have the certificate, whereas somebody who's fluent in the language but doesn't have the certificate can't teach it because just because they can speak it doesn't mean they should be allowed to teach it. Well, that's what we've gotten to in politics. You know, if you don't have the certificate, I have been a professional politician for at least 20 years, then you're not allowed to actually be president because you might know something. Eisenhower, for example, did a pretty decent job without having ever been a professional politician. But that's kind of where we are. So if you take Trump, Carson, Fiorina, and Cruz, because Cruz is actually an outsider who accidentally is in the Senate, but it doesn't matter because he pays no attention to it. Those four people in the poll I saw this morning are 65% of the vote. Now, I've never seen anything like this. I can't think of any time in our history where we had anything like this. Because what it means is, and we've got great friends who are running who we like very much. Marco Rubio's very smart. We've known him since before he was Speaker in Florida. I campaigned with Jeb Bush in 1992. He's a very competent guy. John Kasich is like my younger brother. He was chair of the Budget Committee. Together we balanced the federal budget for 4 years. He is a great governor of Ohio. But they're caught in this time warp where people go, "You've been in office, huh? All right, next person." And they can't, it's very hard for them to get past that, and they haven't found the formula to start a new conversation. So I find it an utterly fascinating time. Now, the Democrats have a different situation. Some of you probably watched how many of you watched the debate for the Democrats, okay? First of all, think about this. If I had come in here and said to you, there were two debates the other night. One was a bunch of old white people. The other was an African-American, two Latinos, a very competent woman CEO, et cetera. You would have assumed, historically, that I just described the Democratic Party's debate. I was struck by two things in the debate the other night. One, and it's very interesting, I mean, they are so whacked, and the news media is so whacked with them. When Bernie Sanders said, "I don't care about your damn emails," the correct answer was to say, of course not. He doesn't care about national security. Why would he care that his secrets are leaked? He doesn't believe in secrets. He doesn't believe in the world. I mean, his idea of a real offensive against ISIS will be to ship them Vermont maple syrup. It'll get really hot in the middle of the desert, it'll gum up the tanks, they won't be able to move, and we'll win a peaceful victory. But nobody connected the dots. Of course he doesn't care. I mean, this is a man who was on the Veterans Committee watching the disaster of the Veterans Administration, who believes that the answer to the current health situation is to extend the Veterans Administration to every American. Now, do you know how hard it is to keep that idea in your head? I mean, you have to reject every fact you learn on the committee. And yet, he's a very sincere socialist. This is a guy who went to the Soviet Union for his honeymoon. Now, again, he's from Vermont. Cold weather and large trees make a lot of sense. They were looking around, where should we go? We could do Canada, but we do Canada all the time. Why don't we do the Soviet Union? Right? And I'm sure it was it wasn't a statement of his ideological commitment, but it was just weird. So you have the Democrats have as their major challenger to the front runner a person who, on a good day, is weird. And has been weird his entire life, but we haven't minded because the great thing about the Congress is, it's different in the presidency. You only get one president, so you should try to have somebody who's semi-stable. But you can have people in the House and Senate who are really kooky. And they're sort of balanced off by other kookies. So the right-wing kookies and the left-wing kookies balance each other off, and then the folks in the middle try to govern. And so I never worry when somebody like Sanders comes along because I figure, it's okay. Everybody's allowed to have a couple. But now he's running for president. Well, this would be catastrophic on a grand scale. If you take the novel I've just written, Duplicity, this is a guy who has no answer for ISIS, no answer for Boko Haram, no answer for the Taliban, no answer for Al-Qaeda. He basically represents a totally different worldview. Now, the person that is the front runner is, if you want to understand why the American people believe there's widespread corruption, watch the Clinton campaign. When asked in one of those things, what words do you associate? If you say Hillary Clinton, the number one word now is liar. Now, this is a severe challenge for a candidate. Because it means that every time you talk, people don't listen. Because they don't trust you. And I think the Clinton campaign is a layer cake. The top layer is Benghazi. The next layer is emails. The layer under that is Huma Abedin, her personal assistant, and the layer under that is Cheryl Mills, her chief of staff, and the layer under that is the Clinton Foundation. And the press cannot handle all the layers at one time, but we have a year. And they're going to just grind through day after day, week after week, and it's bizarre. How you could have this much baggage and think you could become president is just an astonishment, but it's also the Clinton model. They survived cattle futures, they survived the Rose Law Firm. I mean, you name it, they've survived it. So their attitude is, you get up in the morning, you say, I'll bet mean people are attacking us, but I'm not going to pay any attention to them. And I don't know why you'd raise those questions, because, you know, those questions were raised a year ago, and that's now old news, so let's go to new news. Now, the problem you've got is, we've now, all of us, had over 20 years of this. So we're sort of gradually learning the dance. And it's a real problem. So over here you have the Democrats, and I think, by the way, I don't know, how many of you watched Biden today announce he wasn't running? Did it struck you? Callista got me to watch it. I didn't even know he was going to do it. And she told me he's going to speak at the White House, which I assume meant he was not going to run. Two observations. The first is, the announcement he was not running was one paragraph. The next 15 minutes were the campaign speech he would give if he were running. And I thought it was very interesting that the president came out with him. I'm not quite sure what their reasoning was. But I watched Obama's face around minute 12. Where he's thinking, come on. I mean, Joe, wrap it, baby. I mean, and of course, he just went on and on. But here's my theory. The last 14 minutes of his 15-minute event were designed to say to the Democrats, if Hillary collapses, you can get, I'm happy to jump in. So I think it wasn't like, I'm not ever going to run. It was like, I can't compete with her until she collapses, but she may collapse, and I don't want you to forget me if she collapses. I'm available. In fact, I'm enthusiastic. In fact, I'll come to your hometown Tuesday and cook dinner for you. So, I'm going to throw this open in a second, but let me just say something that I mentioned earlier to Sandy. There are two really great books that have come out that I think help explain and justify this library. The first is Pat Buchanan's remarkable book, Comeback, which is really Richard Nixon from 1964 to 1968. And it is, as somebody who's done all this stuff myself professionally, it is a remarkably well-done book. I mean, you really see day by day how Nixon thinks through recovery and how he thinks through the opportunity and how he makes it all work. And it is one of the great campaigns in American history. I mean, the hard part was getting the nomination. And it's really a remarkable book. The other is a new book, and I will once again forget the guy's name. Irv Gelman wrote a book that just came out recently that I am utterly fascinated by, on Eisenhower and Nixon, in which he went to the archives and read the memos that thousands and thousands of memos involving the administration. And it turns out that Richard Nixon played a very active, very important role in the Eisenhower administration, dramatically bigger than any of the academics have been willing to concede up to now. And I think that book is going to change everybody's view of how central Nixon was to the emergence of the modern Republican Party and to playing a key role in the civil rights movement. It's easy to forget when you go see Selma and all these things because of the bias of Hollywood. In the 1950s, it was the Republicans who were in the process of integrating America, and it was segregationist Democrats who were in the process of locking up African Americans who wanted freedom. And all of that has gotten totally turned around, and this book is a major step back to explaining what really happened in that period and how central Nixon was. And I think libraries like this play a really key role in allowing future generations to come into touch with the facts. And one of the things that Callista's really worked on with all of her Ellis books is to make them very factual, not right-wing, not left-wing, just very factual, so that young people grow up learning the facts of America. And in the movie we're doing on George Washington, our hope is to make it so factually compelling that whether you're a liberal or a conservative, you begin to understand this is why he was the father of our country. So I think this institution plays a major role in helping educate future Americans, and I'm grateful to all of you who support the library and who are members of the library. If it's okay, I'm going to toss it open for questions. Is that all right?
Good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can imagine him in a classroom, years ago as a college professor, challenging those kids with this kind of talk. And I never knew you did stand-up. You were great at it. Is he that funny around the house, Calista? Now, I'm going to ask the first question, if I may, sir. Tomorrow, the Secretary of State, the candidate, will be before the Benghazi Committee. What are we going to see in the headlines and on TV tomorrow night? How do you think she's going to do? And if you have questions, raise your hand, and I'll come to you.
Well, I think that Congressman Gowdy, Trey Gowdy, is a very, very good prosecutor. I think he had a lot of background preparing cases. And I think he went very slowly and he gathered information. He frankly had to go slower because the executive branch did everything it could to drag its feet and not be helpful. And as recently as a couple of weeks ago, they found, I think, 1,100 or 1,300 emails from the ambassador in Libya asking for more security. And Gowdy made the comment publicly that he did not understand why the other 5 committees that have been looking into this hadn't found these emails, but it was a process of really like pulling teeth to get the bureaucracy to give them up. And I think one of the things that she's going to be faced with tomorrow is, were you aware as the head of your department that the ambassador who reported directly to you had for 4 months been asking for more security and had been rejected by a guy, by the way, who's still in the department, who has not even to this day been fired? And I think that that's the kind of thing you're going to get. It's not just focusing on those 3 or 4 days, but it's the whole framework. And a good friend of mine, Pete Hoekstra, just wrote a book on the loss of Libya, which really pins Secretary Clinton and President Obama for having totally mismanaged what happened in Libya, where we went from a Gaddafi who was a bad guy, but he was a rational bad guy who was actually running the country and who was deeply opposed to the radicals. To chaos, which is what they've now had for the last couple of years, which has been the Obama gift across the entire region. I mean, if you can't imagine how much worse the region is today than it was the day that Obama was sworn in. And again, it's not a topic the news media wants to cover because it does make the Obama's receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize look a little weird. But I think I think that'll be the kind of stuff that they will focus on tomorrow. It's not going to be gotcha. I think it's going to be a very serious look at how badly mismanaged the State Department was in Libya.
Mr. Speaker, to your right and in the back here, I have Michael Wimberly, who is 17 years old, a senior at Chapman, the youngest senior at nearby Chapman University, and one of the best bluegrass band players, banjo. What is it? What do you?
Fiddle, my brother.
He plays the fiddle. He plays the fiddle, and I've heard him, and he can do Rocky Top better than anybody you've ever heard. Michael Wimberly. He's a member of the College Republicans, and he has his whole family here. Michael, your question is?
Well, first, I do want to thank you for coming. We really appreciate, I know I can say that, we really appreciate you being here, Mr. Speaker. And, as a Republican, we're looking for someone who can bring back a reverence to the Constitution and a love for America. And I'm really seeing a lot of people that is bringing a rise back to conservatism, and I thank you for being a part of that. My question is that of all the things that you could say are wrong with America, the economy is probably one of the foremost concerns that the American people have. And so my question to you is, how can Congress and the President work together to decrease the debt and to fix the economy? There are a lot of campaign promises going around today, but what are some actual tactical policy issues that can be used to help our economy?
He's running for office, obviously.
Look, I'll just give you 3 examples, and this is the kind of stuff we did when I was Speaker in the 90s, and it was a big part of why we had economic growth and why we were able to balance the budget. First, I think you want to dramatically deregulate. If you go and talk to small businesses, they are crushed with red tape, they're crushed with regulations. All of those things divert money away from economic growth into compliance with bureaucrats in Washington who actually don't pay any attention to the forms you fill out anyway. So I think fundamental deregulation. Second, I think that we should adopt a policy of going after the crooks. I once did a foreword for a book called Stop Paying the Crooks, which we thought was a pretty powerful title, but got nowhere in Washington, and people didn't understand the concept. But our estimate is that we have at least $200 billion a year stolen from the federal government in a variety of forms. And that if the federal government were as effective at stopping fraud as American Express or Visa or MasterCard, we would probably save at least $170 or $180 billion a year, every year, that's currently being given away to crooks. And then the third thing I would say is to move towards a dramatically more efficient, leaner, and smaller federal government. You look at the degree to which modern industry is using smartphones and computers and laptops and the cloud and all this stuff, and getting faster, more accurate, leaner. For example, you can go anywhere in the world with your credit card, go up to an ATM, put in your 4-number code, get money. It takes about 11 seconds, almost anywhere in the world. It takes 177 days to move a veteran's records from the Defense Department to the VA. Now that's crazy. There's no reason you have to accept this level of utter incompetence.
Good. In the third row here, and I'm not sure I should do this, he's a lawyer. He's a litigator, Mr. Speaker, from Villa Park. Sir?
Mr. Speaker, thank you again for coming. My question is simple. Constitutionally, do you believe that there's any obstacle to a non-member of the House serving as Speaker?
No, there's no constitutional obstacle because it simply says the House shall elect a Speaker. It doesn't say where the Speaker has to come from. But here's the practical thing. People run for office because they have an ambition to serve. So you now have 247 Republicans. Let's assume that 10% of them think they could be Speaker. That's 24.7. They don't want some outsider brought in. That's an insult to all 24. And their first reaction is going to be, I'm going to find a way to undermine you and destroy you, because why should I let somebody who didn't run for office, didn't pay their dues, doesn't go home every weekend, doesn't have to deal with the voters, why should I let them be the head of the House? And so, you know, Sean Hannity called me when Kevin decided he would not, that he couldn't put the majority together. And he very cleverly mousetrapped me, and Calista sort of laughed at me after it was over. Because he said, if 218 members came to you and asked you to serve, would you? Well, doing a movie on George Washington, of course you're going to say yes. I mean, this is your duty. Now, what he didn't ask me was, how likely do you think that is? So it's technically interesting, and my guess is Paul Ryan will be Speaker, and we'll see whether or not he can learn. You know, my model of leadership was listen, learn, help, and lead in that order. And Paul's a brilliant guy, he's a great policy guy, but he's going to have to do a lot of listening to be able to run the House.
Member of our President's Council, Russ Colvin, in the front row.
Mr. Speaker, my question has to do with the recent Chinese cyber attacks against the United States, which were unprecedented in their scale. I've recently heard of cyber warfare being described as the newest branch of the U.S. military. I was discussing this with a friend of mine who's a professor at the Naval War College, and he said that it's likely that many of those hackers were educated in the United States. And so in discussing that with him, he's telling me that there are thousands of Chinese students who are attending MIT, Harvard, Stanford, the best U.S. universities, and being trained in the area of computer science. So my question is, should we be limiting the number of Chinese or even Russian students who are learning computer science in the United States?
Thank you.
I actually don't believe in limiting first-class foreign students for two reasons. One is, a lot of them end up staying here and creating companies. I think 40% of the companies in Silicon Valley have one of the founders started out as a foreign student. And so they generate huge volume of jobs and wealth. But the second is, let's say you come out of China or Russia. China is a real dictatorship. Russia is sort of a corrupt oligarchic dictatorship. It's not as efficiently a dictatorship as China anymore. But they're both not nice places. And you come to the University of Michigan, or you come to UCSD, or to Southern Cal, or UCLA, and you look around and you realize everybody here is free. You know, we were just in Israel 2 weeks ago, and you talk to young Palestinians who have to go through checkpoints to get to their school. And if they get to come over here as an intern and they suddenly realize you can actually go 3,000 miles with no checkpoints. And you suddenly think differently. So at that level, I don't worry about it. I think our challenge is to figure out what is our doctrine for this, okay? So you're going to steal my secrets. What am I going to do to you? You know, and we don't have a good doctrine for that right now. Partially, again, if all of you just think about this, because up until about 5 or 6 years ago, the most successful system on the planet was the United States. We hacked into more places. We got more secrets. I mean, even in Nixon's time, Sandy will remember, they bugged Brezhnev's limousine when Nixon went to Moscow so they could listen to Brezhnev going to and from the meetings, which when the Russians learned about it a decade later, were really irritated. So, I mean, we have been very, very good at this for a very long time. And I think for a while we were kind of afraid to get into it. But you can't have things like the North Koreans attacking Sony, and you can't have the scale of the break-ins the Chinese are doing. And I suspect we will presently have to find answers. But the answers may not be in computer and cyber warfare. The answer, for example, the Chinese might be, we're going to close off half of your exports. The French did this one time to the Japanese. They got in a big trade fight, and they said all of the products, all the television products coming out of Japan will go through one port, which will have 3 inspectors. And when the line got to be sufficiently long, like they were sitting there for 180 days, the Japanese said, you know, I do think we want to talk about this. So we need to be clever and not necessarily get stuck into one zone where we don't know what we're doing, but we need to raise the cost, particularly the Chinese, of behavior that's clearly the behavior of an outlaw government.
Ben Chapman, a conservative blogger from Costa Mesa. Ben?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for being here. First of all, I think many of the people in this room would love to see you being Speaker again, because we haven't had the kind of unity since you've been Speaker, for one. So my question is with the presidential candidates. I know you've mentioned Trump and Fiorina and the outsiders and Cruz and Carson. Myself being a constitutional conservative, a lot of the younger conservatives are really upset with the establishment. The older generations are really fed up with being lied to over the years. Do you think that Donald Trump, although he is saying what a lot of people are feeling, do you think that him saying that he is basically for government-run health care and funding parts of Planned Parenthood and whatnot, do you think he would be the strongest candidate for the Republicans, or do you think that title should go to Cruz or Rand Paul or fiscally constitutional conservatives?
Well, it depends on what you mean by strongest candidate. If you mean the candidate most able to win, we'll find out. I mean, we're a long way from a decision here. The fact that Trump's the front runner and that I spend a fair amount of time because he's so funny, building a speech around him doesn't mean I think he's automatically the nominee. I think we're a long way from picking a nominee. There's no question that if you had somebody like Cruz, for example, who is a constitutional lawyer who has won Supreme Court cases and clerked for the Supreme Court, you'd have a very different quality. But you could also imagine a circumstance where you end up with a Trump presidency or a Carson presidency, and Cruz is the Attorney General, which would be a nightmare to every liberal in the country. There are a lot of ways this will get. There are a lot of ways that this will get played out. All I would remind you of, and this is a great place to have this conversation, is Goldwater broke out from the Eastern establishment controlling the Republican Party, but he did so in a way which guaranteed he couldn't win. Along comes Nixon, who wins 4 short years later. I mean, people thought we'd only carried 5 states with Goldwater, or 6 states with Goldwater, and people thought the party's virtually dead. 4 years later, Nixon gets elected. We go through all the pain of Watergate. We have the party collapses in '74. People think, oh my gosh, we got down. I ran the first time in 1974. It was really stupid timing on my part. We got down to where there were, I think, 17% of the country identified as Republicans. And 6 years later, you get Ronald Reagan. I mean, so you don't know. electability is a big part of this. You want somebody who will in fact do what you believe in, and you want them to get there to do it. And I think hopefully that's what we're going to sort out in the next few months. And hopefully guys like Trump, remember, Trump didn't have policies. Trump had opinions. Trump was a business guy shooting his mouth off in New York. Well, I mean, if you're hanging out in New York, you're automatically 20 degrees more liberal than the Republican Party. You know, and so he's really going through his own education. And he will not be the same person this December that he was last December, because he's out here exposed to people every day and learning about a country in ways that you only learn as a candidate. As Calista can tell you, it is an amazing experience to be a candidate and to be immersed in the people and to learn from people every single day.
All right, a couple more. A retired Marine from Fullerton.
Mr. Speaker, we met in '96 at the convention in San Diego. I'm going to shift gears and probably get booed out of here, but I would like to ask if you and your wife have thought about taking what you have done today, and in about a year and a month, the National Review will have the post-election cruise. Perhaps you might want to go, or if you've already been invited, are you thinking of going, or am I just whistling in the wind here?
Well, I don't know why I'd be booed about that. I mean, first of all, we like to go on cruises. If the right offer is made for the right ship and it's gone to the right place, I'm there, baby. I mean, don't worry about it. We were on a cruise the night of the second Republican debate, the CNN debate that competed with Gone with the Wind for length. And so we decided, since we were on the cruise, that we would simply invite the whole ship to watch the debate with us. And they took the largest single room on the ship, and we had a couple of hundred people who showed up and watched the debate. It was fun, and they all thought I was going to analyze it. And I said, no, I'm here to ask you what you think. And we got a lot of really interesting comments that night, so it was a lot of fun. So yeah, I mean, you know, talk to National Review, give us a call, we're available. I mean, you know, anybody else who has an interesting idea like that, I want you to feel very free to be creative. Sandy can get to us every day, so just walk up to Sandy and say, I got an offer here, don't worry about it.
All right, a 13-year-old who goes to Oxford Prep has a question, sir.
Mr. Speaker, just quickly, thank you for your service to our country. I think everyone in this room really appreciates it. My question is, as a student, an 8th grader who's going to college in 4 years, my question is, do you have a game plan or a strategy for the Republican Party to bring more conservatives into the academia, specifically in colleges?
I do. I personally do. I don't know if the party does. I was asked this yesterday at a speech, and I said, look, every conservative student in the country should take notes every time a liberal professor says something which is factually false. And they should complain to the provost of their school. And if the faculty member tries to punish them in grades, they should then file a lawsuit. And you have about 6, you know. The time, and I always tell audiences like this, I mean, half of you give money to your alma mater to hire people to teach your grandchildren to despise you. I mean, you know, this is nuts. And so I think you're not going to, you know, I always tell people, freedom is not given. Freedom is earned. If you want to take back the campuses, you have to root out the people who are ideologically committed to a false view of history and a false view of reality, and you got to be prepared to take them head on. And I think that's very important. One of my favorite stories is at Stanford after the fall of the Soviet Empire. Gorbachev was there for dinner. And about 2/3 of the way through dinner, one of the Stanford faculty said to him, you know, President Gorbachev,
Thank you.
communism could have worked. The fact that it didn't work in the Soviet Union was the way it was implemented. But it could have worked. And Gorbachev stared at this guy and said, only an American faculty member could believe that.
All right, our last question is from James Day, and he is with the Catholic Television Network.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks for being here. One of the most moving films that I've seen was the film you produced with your wife on John Paul II, his trip to Poland. And I was just wondering if you can comment, here we are a month later after Pope Francis's visit to the United States. In light of what you saw John Paul do in Poland so many years ago and how that transformed that nation, what are your thoughts on what the Pope may have done for us nationally and for the Catholics who may be here?
That's a wonderful question. And let me say, first of all, that we were very fortunate to be able to do 9 days to change the world. And I should say to all of you, I do 2 free newsletters a week that you can get. You can sign up at Gingrich Productions. And if you're interested in our films and things, 9 Days to Change the World is there. And it's an astonishing film, and it's an astonishing story. And John Paul II is, in fact, one of the key figures in the destruction of the Soviet Empire, because he reasserted religious liberty in Poland in a way that was incompatible with the Soviet dictatorship. We were very fortunate in that Callista, who has sung for a long time at the Basilica Choir, the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, was there to sing for Pope Francis. And let me be quite clear, Pope Francis is very different from John Paul II. John Paul II was Polish, deeply rooted in the European tradition, deeply anti-communist because he'd lived it. He had seen the Nazis and became a priest at a time when there was a death penalty from the Nazis. He remained a priest under the Soviets, who were deeply anti-religious. I remind people, they wouldn't let you pray in school. They were tearing down crosses. I mean, things it's hard for you to believe. And Francis is very different. Francis is the first, and Callista said this yesterday in a meeting, he's the first third world pope. His experience of life was Argentina. He'd never been to the United States until he landed on this trip. And so a lot of what's going on, and we wrote a piece you can pull up from the Wall Street Journal, the former ambassador Jim Nicholson to the Vatican and I co-authored, on introducing him to American free enterprise, which is very different than the crony capitalism and corruption of Argentina. And you could see that he was overwhelmed by the country. You could see that he was overwhelmed by the emotion and the friendship and the love that poured out. We saw him at the White House when he was received that morning. We saw him at the Basilica when he came for Mass and canonized a saint from California. It was a great moment. We had the opportunity then to go and be at the Capitol when he spoke, and John Boehner invited us to come and sit in the family box, and a remarkable moment. And if you go and look at that speech, there are parts of it that are amazingly pro-American. I mean, not at all what people expected. People sort of thought he was going to come and, lecture us. But in fact, he came and he talked about religious liberty. He talked about how much the Americans are imbued with this commitment. When he talked, we were not there, but when he talked with the bishops and the cardinals at St. Matthew's, I was told later by one of the bishops that they were all delighted because they thought he was going to come and lecture them. And he came and he thanked them. And he said, this is such a generous church that the American contribution to charities worldwide is unlike anybody else. So they're sitting there, the Pope likes them. They found this very cool. Then we watched him in New York, and any of you who've ever watched Cardinal Dolan know that he is just amazing. And he and the Pope got along brilliantly. And then Philadelphia, where there were at least 850,000 people at Mass. I mean, do you know how many people you have to have giving out communion if you have 850,000 people at Mass? So the only reason I tell you all this is I think this was a moment of education for somebody who had never been here before. Now, I think that he's doing 2 contradictory things, and the news media cannot get this straight. He is opening the church up in the deepest sense of saying to Catholics worldwide, you have to go out to the people. And Christ, after all, we just spent a week in Israel. I mean, Christ walked with the people. Christ wasn't hidden in some church. And so I think part of what he's saying is an openness, which the news media promptly says, oh, that means he'll be liberal. Well, he's not very liberal. He's, in fact, a very traditional Catholic. But he's a traditional Catholic who takes selfies. And that just totally screws up the news media. Because they go, how can you be modern, which he is, and how can you be so humble, which he is, and actually believe all that 2,000-year-old stuff, which he does? And his answer is, that's actually what being Pope's about. I'll just close this because there's a great line. He's flying back from Cuba, and he sits down with some American reporters who are on the plane on the way to Washington. And he says, I'm not a conservative Republican, and I'm not a liberal Democrat. I am the Pope of 1,400,000,000 people. And I try to speak for the church, not for some ideology. And I think in that sense he's a historic figure. We have not done a movie on him yet because we can't figure him out. But I think as you watch him unwind and you watch him unfold, he will be a truly historic figure and somebody who I think will broaden the church and will bring back into the church many people who felt that somehow they had lost their roots. So let me just say again to Sandy, to the staff here, to the team, Callista and I are always thrilled. We're already talking about coming back next year with Ellis and the Presidents and with my next novel, which will be called Treason. You can imagine that thematic. But we always love coming here, and we look forward very much to future opportunities. Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. They will autograph your books. Go out and stick to the left, and you'll see the signing table. Thank you for coming.